Welcome back. In this last lecture of week two, we'll briefly run through some of the final issues leading into the very productive period of the 6th century and figures like Severus of Antioch and the Emperor Justinian in terms of resolving lingering Christological issues as well as the resultant schisms and the establishment of alternate or parallel ecclesiastical structures, especially in Alexandria and Antioch, that perdure, especially in terms of the Coptic Church, up to this very day, taking Severus as one of their great patriarchs and theological masters. So we'll look at the situation with the Emperor Zeno, Archbishop of Constantinople Acacius, and also then Zeno's Henotikon, and then we'll end up with Pope Hormisdas and the resolution of the Acacian Schism, and finish off with a few thoughts going into the Emperor Justinian, his a very important role with the attempt to reconcile the strict Chalcedonians, the Neo-Chalcedonians, or the Cyrillians, and the Miaphysites that come under the banner of Severus of Antioch and take him as their theological master. One thing to note is this lecture will be one of the final lectures, or if not the final lecture, that deals mainly with historical context and data. In the following lectures, although historical context will be provided, the theme will turn more towards theology proper and the working out of the implications of Chalcedon through the competing schools of the three schools I've already mentioned. And we might call this the Byzantine turn in the 6th century because we're moving away from a discussion that includes or interacts with in any great detail the whole Nestorian movement, the Nestorian schism, and the resultant great Church of the East of Syria. The parallel see in Antioch that became clearly Nestorian and continues to exist today. And if you want a bit of background on the Nestorian Church, I would recommend the chapter on that church in Robert Louis Wilkins' The First 1,000 Years. It's an excellent overview and quite eye-opening and insightful in terms of the extent that, or the geographical extent that the Nestorian Church achieved a certain kind of ecclesiastical hegemony and influence over, as well as its importance in the certain missionary efforts all the way into Asia, especially China. So I would recommend that if you want to look more into the Nestorian Church, the great Church of the East of Syria. But as it is, because we're dealing with the development of Orthodox Byzantine Christology, the whole Nestorian question now will be in large part left behind, and we'll zero in more carefully and extensively on the remaining issues within the context of Byzantine theology rather than Nestorian or Syrian theology of that persuasion. Just to set the table a bit, we're looking at the period of the years 474 roughly through 519, basically the beginning of Emperor Zeno's reign in Constantinople, all the way up to Pope Hormisdas and his Libellis Fidei, which in effect ended the Acacian Schism, as well as the accession to the throne of the Emperor Justin, who immediately, the uncle and immediate predecessor of Justinian the First, who will loom large in the following lectures. So just briefly then, some of the main players in this, we'll just cover some of the main players in terms of the apostolic sees. In Rome, we have a list of popes. Pope Hilarius, deacon of Leo at Ephesus, he reigned from 461 to 468, and Simplicius following him. Felix the Third then coming after Simplicius. Felix is important as we'll see later on, for his condemnations of certain figures. Gelasius the First then issued a statement of faith, or a profession of faith, that affirmed the authority of the councils, also affirmed strongly the primacy of the Bishop of Rome. Then we'll see, following in the figure of Pope Anastasius II, a reversal of this kind of hardline Roman stance, and in fact a certain reversal and lifting of the condemnations put in place by Felix. And then after Anastasius, whose reign, as you can see, is quite brief, we have Pope Symmachus, who asserted again the condemnations, as well as the centrality of the ecclesiastical structure in terms of the governance of the church, and the formulation and declaration and enforcing of church dogma with respect to the issues pertaining to Christology coming out of the Council of Chalcedon. Symmachus, while affirming in one sense and recognizing the importance and the different roles and spheres of power and authority with respect to the bishops, and especially the papacy and the empire, because he was quite strident in his tone, he created a lot of animosity, or a lot of animosity resulted from his approach in Constantinople, which ultimately served to continue to some degree the Acacian schism, and this was only resolved with the ascension or accession to the papacy of Pope Hormisdas. And he, in a sense, provides, along with the cooperation of the Emperor Justin, resolution and end to this schism. In Constantinople, we have the figures of the emperors Zeno, Anastasius, and Justin. Zeno took a kind of taciturn approach with respect to the Council of Chalcedon. Anastasius took a more strident or contrary or oppositional stance towards Chalcedon, and then this trend was reversed with the Emperor Justin, and a program of attempted reconciliation and renewal and development along the lines of Chalcedon was begun by the Emperor Justin and his nephew Justinian. The important patriarch, or most important patriarch perhaps, for understanding and explaining the so-called Acacian schism is clearly the patriarch Acacius of Constantinople, who reigned from 472 to 489. His cooperation with the emperor and the emperor's decree of and enforcement of the Henotikon is from whom we get the name the Acacian schism. In Alexandria, turning now to Alexandria, we find that Timothy Aelurus is in power, having driven out the previous pro-Chalcedonian Archbishop of Alexandria, and Timothy is maintaining and fomenting both in terms of doctrinal position, as well as fostering certain political and social unrest, the Miaphysite cause up to that point. His successor, Peter Mongus, will carry out the same pattern of activity until he is eventually deposed and sent into exile. In Antioch, we see in 461 to 469, we have a Chalcedonian on the throne. He was deposed by Zeno, and then the successors were all Miaphysite or Monophysite in tendency. Peter the Fuller had 3 different periods in which he held the chair, occupied the chair of the See of Antioch, and he was deposed and reasserted himself on various occasions. At the same time, we find Julian, who was a Chalcedonian, exiled by Peter the Fuller from Antioch on the basis of Julian's pro-Chalcedonian stance. We have Palladius in 488 to 498, a Chalcedonian who accepted the Henotikon, and then Flavian II from 498 to 512, and this overlaps with the time of Severus of the future Severus, or Severus the future Archbishop of Antioch's work in Rome, and his assistance of the Emperor Anastasius in the composition and enforcement and promulgation of the typos, which was definitely and explicitly anti-Chalcedonian. And finally, Patriarch Severus himself, who was patriarch of a strong Miaphysite, disciple of, attempted to be, and perhaps was, a strict disciple of Cyril of Alexandria and his Miaphysis formula Christology, and the out of two natures formula Christology became patriarch or archbishop of Antioch in the year 511 and held that see until 518, and until he was deposed by the cooperation of Constantinople and Rome, and then fled to a monastery in Palestine. At this point, we see in Antioch the rival sees splitting up. Those that follow the Constantinopolitan Patriarchate and the Empire become to be called the Melkite Church, and then the rival Miaphysite Patriarchate in the same city. And at the same time, we have a third see already established in terms of the Nestorian Church, which will become the great Church of the East. All three of these patriarchates continue to this day, but here we see with Patriarch Severus that the split occurred and the perpetual schism ensued. In terms of what sparked the controversy and the eventual schism was Zeno's decree, 482 decree. Zeno wanted to reestablish theological, doctrinal, ecclesiastical, and political order in the empire. The situations in Antioch and Rome were quite intense, and he wanted to bring some degree of unity. And his decree in 1482, his Henotikon, his document of unity from the Greek henosis, or union, attempted to accomplish this without even mentioning the Council of Chalcedon, its dogmatic formulation, as well as really passing over in silence the issue of the nature of the distinction and union with respect to the person of Christ, the one and the same Lord and Christ. The situation was further exacerbated or made more complex because of the cooperation of the Archbishop of Constantinople, Acacius. It was through the mediation or the mediatory function of the Archbishop of Constantinople that Zeno's Henotikon had a kind of ecclesiastical imprimatur, as well as the nihil obstat. And so the See of Constantinople was willing to pass over in silence the dogmatic declaration of the decrees of Chalcedon, and as well as passing over in silence, also effectively undermining the authority in place of the Council of Chalcedon as an ecumenical council. And then we'll look at the response, which we'll cover later, of the Orthodox, both Byzantine Orthodox as well as, and what I mean by Byzantine is those included within or operating and reasoning theologically and philosophically within Byzantine intellectual context. And these will include figures in Rome, figures in Jerusalem, Palestine, as well as figures in Constantinople. But the main player in this is Pope Hormisdas and his cooperation with the emperor that comes into power following Anastasius, the Emperor Anastasius. It's important to note that Acacius, in the event of the promulgation of the Henotikon, was excommunicated by both Pope Felix and Pope Gelasius, whom we mentioned earlier in one of the earlier slides in this lecture. In addition to the excommunication of Acacius, Peter Mungus of Alexandria, the successor of Timothy the Cat in 477 was also excommunicated, both as being in opposition to Chalcedon um, and in this sense being de facto at the time of their excommunication in opposition to the policy of the Bishop of Rome, as well as the dogmatic formula of the Council of Chalcedon itself. As we move through this time period, it's important to note that on the side of the papacy, there was a reversal of policy. After the excommunications of Peter Mongus and Acacius, Pope Anastasius or Anastasius II reversed the excommunications, and thereby, in the name of the See of Rome, implied strongly a certain reversal of church policy vis-a-vis the empire and emperor's desire to achieve a kind of superficial union without going through Chalcedon. And so in this sense, Pope Anastasius himself intensified and prolonged the problem ensuing in terms of the schism itself, because he reversed the excommunications levied by prior popes. And so when Pope Symmachus, following Pope Anastasius, reversed the policy again regarding the necessity of affirming the Council of Chalcedon, as well as upholding the prior excommunications of both Acacius and Peter Mongus of Alexandria. This created a lot of tension and resentment and obstinacy in especially Constantinople, as well as in Alexandria. So in one sense, at this time, through the pontificates of Felix, Gelasius, Pope Anastasius II, as well as Pope Symmachus, the Bishop of Rome, or the See of Rome, through its various occupants, could be accused of sounding an uncertain trumpet, which was only resolved later on with the accession of, in terms of a practical outworking and an ending of the schism, with the accession of Pope Pope Hormisdas the First, and his Libellus Fidei, his book on the profession of faith. So just a little bit more background on Zeno and his Henotikon. By the year 425, Constantinople has, through the patronage of the emperors, become a center of intellectual life to rival both Alexandria and Athens. Importantly, during the same period within Constantinople, we see the rise of Syriac, Coptic, and Armenian as languages of literature that served to spread Monophysite writings in those various areas. So in Antioch, Egypt, and Armenia, through and from Constantinople, and the diffusion of experts, literary masters in those languages, the theology and the theological writings in favor of monophysitism began to be spread more widely. In addition to this flourishing or rebirth of intellectual life in Constantinople and the spread of literature in multiple languages outside of Greek and to a lesser extent Latin, we find that after Chalcedon, promises or problems were unnecessarily compounded. In the first place, Leo's first tome was mistranslated, and these mistranslations made the Pope appear Nestorian, which of course would create difficulties and opposition from the Alexandrians. Secondly, right after the council, another issue that created great problems in terms of the ecclesiastical and political and social aspects of the situation Archbishop Juvenal of Jerusalem was driven from his see upon his return from Chalcedon and replaced with an anti-Chalcedonian archbishop. Another aspect is, and we've mentioned this earlier, is Marcion and Pulcheria, the emperor and the empress, resorted to violence to quell rebellions in various places, especially Alexandria. And another thing of note is that in 457, Marcion discovers and publishes the Apollinarian provenance of Cyril's Miaphysis formula. But this apparently fell on deaf ears, probably because of a lack of trust and a belief in the bad faith of the emperor and the upholders and defenders of Chalcedon on the part of the Miaphysites or Monophysites. And this doesn't make one iota of difference. In one sense, the issue that we raised in an earlier lecture of a truly heretical source and an ambiguous formulation becomes, in effect, canonized through the conciliar recommendation and recognition of Cyril and his writings at both Ephesus and Chalcedon. So in terms of fundamental theology and the evaluating of theological sources in terms of the writings of the church fathers and doctors, even in the very day, even though Cyril was a not too distant contemporary of Chalcedon and the years subsequent, nevertheless, through the recognition and affirmation of the councils of Ephesus and Chalcedon, Cyril's formula, which is truly Apollinarian, becomes itself quasi-canonical, and the church, from a methodological and source-based perspective, has to deal with this. And this remains a problem and continues to remain a problem today between the Orthodox, both Catholic and Byzantine, and the Miaphysites today. Another big issue in terms of civil unrest that created a lot of a great deal of hard feelings and, in a sense, solidified these poles of opposition between the various sees is that upon Marcion's death in what was the year? I think it was 457. Proterius, the pro-Chalcedonian and relatively peaceful Archbishop of Canterbury, was murdered, and Timothy Elurus takes his place under much protest from especially Rome and the papacy. And Timothy then uses his various networks of influence to both spread the Cyrillian Miaphysite account and explanation of the union in Christ, as well as to continue to quell through his own means of violence any opposition in his areas of authority, in his regions wherein he had authority. As one can easily see, the church order and the order of the imperium was in a bit of disarray, and the Emperor Zeno naturally wanted to reestablish order when he came to the throne in the year 474. However, his methods were not truly ecclesiastical, and they weren't according to a sound theological hermeneutic and method. And the result was further disaster in the church in terms of church unity, and eventually effectuated a certain schism. Perhaps the schism was unavoidable, but through his Henotikon, his decree of union of 482, he ended up undermining the very order that Constantinople and Rome together had sought to establish, with some hesitation on the part of the Roman bishops, or the bishops of Rome, beginning with Leo, on the nature of ecumenical councils themselves. But nevertheless, because of the pre-established agreement and order recognizing Chalcedon in Constantinople and Rome, when he, through the cooperation of the Archbishop of Constantinople at the time, Acacius, decided to try to establish doctrinal and thereby ecclesiastical and social and political order through his Henotikon, while avoiding the very mention or all mention of Chalcedon. This only served to undermine the very foundations of ecclesiastical authority in Constantinople as well as in Rome, and as the authority ramifies into the union and relationship with the other, or relationships plural, with the other great sees of early Christianity, namely Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria. You had the opportunity to read the decree in that passage from Evagrius Scholasticus, and so I won't take too much time. There are three main characteristics, however, that cause the difficulty, or really only one difficulty, and two other aspects were important. In the first place, the Henotikon endorsed the condemnation of both Eutychus and Nestorius. So again, you see an exclusion of the in principle and formally heretical position of monophysitism, as well as the same in principle and formally heretical but opposite error and heresy of Nestorius. The Henotikon also, with the previous ecumenical councils, approves of Cyril, namely his 12 chapters of condemnation of Nestorius. But, and this is where the problem arises, he makes absolutely no mention of Chalcedon, or whether Christ had one or two natures. This is a problem because this is precisely the issues under dispute between Rome, Constantinople on the one hand, and Alexandria, and certain members of the Church of Antioch on the other. It's the very issue that the Council of Chalcedon, based upon Nicaea, Constantinople, and Ephesus, actually did resolve and present a solid foundation of the revelation of the union between natures in one person, or union of two natures in one person, of Christ. And so it was an anti-dogmatic, anti-ecclesiastical method through which Zeno wrongly sought to establish the same dogmatic unity. Well, the reaction on the part of the Bishop of Rome at the time, Pope Felix III, was predictable. He saw this move on the part of the emperor and Acacius as a threat to both Leo and the position of Rome vis-a-vis the other churches, as well as the role of the papacy in ecumenical councils as undermined, and in addition to the undermining of the position of the Bishop of Rome, it also undermined what was or had been accepted and affirmed as an ecumenical council, namely the Council of Chalcedon. So Pope Felix immediately deposed Acacius from the see of Constantinople. With the death of Emperor Zeno, we have the situation actually get worse. Whereas Zeno was wont to follow a policy of silence with respect to Chalcedon, and perhaps temporizing with respect to Chalcedon, the Emperor Anastasius, who became emperor in 491, he refused to enforce Chalcedon at all. But he not only refused to enforce it, he turned, in a sense, against it. And in his turning against Chalcedon, this created greater confusion and opposition between Constantinople, Alexandria, and Rome. And what the Anastasius does is he commissions a young lawyer from Beirut, lawyer who turned monk patrologist from Beirut, Severus, to compose the so-called Typus, an imperial document, excuse me, clearly and openly hostile to Chalcedon. So instead of being silent and passing over Chalcedon, now there was an imperial stance of opposition with respect to the council. And clearly then, as I've already mentioned, this was a departure from the policy taken by Zeno and Acacius's Henotikon. And this is what provoked the so-called Acacian schism, which lasted until the accession of the Emperor Justin in 518 and his cooperation with Pope Hormisdas, Bishop of Rome, in 519. By the year 511, Severus is departing from Constantinople, and as a reward for his cooperation with Emperor Anastasius, at least in part, he was placed in the position of Archbishop of Antioch, and then takes over the kind of the Miaphysite stronghold, and in fact becomes its most skilled and effective spokesman at the time in terms of the theological niceties and the working out of all the implications, as he understood them, of the writings of Cyril. And his authority, as I've mentioned earlier, remains to this day. However, with the coming to the throne of Justin in Constantinople, Severus is ousted and he flees to Egypt, and he remains in Egypt under the protection of Monophysite monks, where he continues to write apologetical works in favor of monophysitism or miaphysitism, and theological tomes articulating his perhaps ultra Cyrillian or Monophysite position. Pope Hormisdas is the pope that saw the reconciliation between Rome and Constantinople after the death of Pope Symmachus. And it is to Pope Hormisdas that the credit is given for the resolution and ending of the so-called Acacian Schism. This is especially found in his Libellus Fidei, which contains a confession affirming the the Chalcedonian doctrine, as well as condemns Dioscorus of Alexandria, Nestorius, as well as Timothy the Cat of Alexandria and his successor Peter. He also affirms that the doctrine of Pope Leo, as declared in the Council of Chalcedon, is the true faith and must be held, and that there must be maintained communion with the See of Rome. And you can look at the Libellus Fidei, as well as the preceding document from Pope Symmachus, which evokes such a strong reaction against the papacy, in Denzinger Numbers 363 and following, and for Symmachus 362. So we admittedly had a very rapid run through of the period of time and the situations that remained or lingered, as well as the new twists and difficulties in the reception of Chalcedon and the articulation of the import of Chalcedon in that period from Zeno to the rise of Pope Hormisdas and the Emperor Justin. And with the accession of Justin, especially Justinian, we find a strong reaffirmation of Chalcedon. However, in that same time period, the Emperor Justinian, who comes to the throne in 527, will want to find a resolution to the opposition between three main groups: the strict Chalcedonians, the Neo-Chalcedonians, represented especially by Justinian himself, and the what we have of the Council of Constantinople 553, as well as the strong Miaphysite or Monophysite position that is articulated and defended by Severus of Antioch. So we will see that but clearly this is a turning away from questions pertaining to Nestorianism and toward those Byzantine disagreements and conflicts. And so, as I've mentioned, Nestorianism is no longer really an active partner in the topics of discussions with respect to what becomes Christological orthodoxy, or what is, in fact, and always was Christological orthodoxy in terms of the Chalcedonian heritage, because naturally there's an assumption on the part of the Orthodox, whether Catholic or Byzantine, of the correctness of the formulation of Chalcedon as an articulation and defense and clarification of what was always in the first revealed by Christ himself in his incarnation. So in the following lectures, we'll turn more strictly to figures and specific councils in their teaching, and look more deeply into and give more attention, more extended attention and thematic attention to the doctrinal issues under dispute in order to unpack and understand this development of Christological orthodoxy in this Byzantine period from the 6th century through the present day, but hitting a certain new high points in the reception of the Damascene, and by implication St. Maximus the Confessor in the Latin Middle Ages, as well as developments in Byzantine theology in terms of the writings of and teachings of St. Gregory of Palamas.